Pokemon has been around for almost 30 years, meaning this franchise has been through several generations of kids. And while Pokemon is supposed to be a wholesome experience to share with your friends, I'm seeing more and more debate about the golden age of Pokemon. Put simply, what is the best era of Pokemon games? See, this is a bit different than asking the best generation, because this question wants to know the general time period that was the best. Obviously, there's no official distinction between the different eras of Pokemon, so I decided to make them myself. The easiest way to do this would be by consoles, but I don't think that would be fair since certain consoles had more games than others. Instead, I'm going to separate the generations by when I feel like the games had the biggest jumps in quality or gameplay. The original era will be the first 3 generations, the middle era will be gens 4, 5, and 6, and the modern era will be Sun and Moon and beyond. I know some people might consider Gen 7 as a part of the middle era, but to me, the changes made in that game were way too different to be considered like the previous ones. With that being established, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each generation's games to find out which is the best. And yes, I'm aware that I have some bias of my own, so I've created a point system to help keep things a little more fair. As objectively as I can, I'm going to rate the visuals, gameplay, music, and impact of each game in each era, and then average out the score. Starting things off, the original era of Pokemon gave us the beginning of everything. When Red and Blue was released in America, it started a movement that seemingly could not be stopped. At the same time, the Game Boy was dominating the handheld market. In fact, it had been around for years, staying relevant through classics like Tetris, Mario, and Zelda. This alone was impressive, as this console's graphics were super outdated due to gaming entering the 3D era. For this reason, Nintendo never really expected Pokemon to do very well. For some reason, it resonated more than almost any other franchise they put out. The gameplay of Red and Blue was simple. You play as a kid in the world of Pokemon, and then you catch, train, and battle with them. Additionally, you can trade and battle Pokemon with your real-life friends, which I'm sure was a major factor in the widespread growth of the franchise. The gameplay was simple, and that's all it really needed to be. I'm not going to pretend like these games were a masterpiece though. The graphics are the worst in the series, the gameplay and battle is broken and unbalanced, and there's a ton of glitches. So when the sequel to these games came out, people were probably expecting some improvements, and they definitely came. The second generation of Pokemon improved every aspect of the game and added more things like a day and night cycle, breeding, new items, a huge post-game, and full color. Looking back now, I'm impressed by how much they added to these games, and I wouldn't even have a hard time playing Crystal today. There were certainly still issues though, as the balancing of gameplay was still not great despite the addition of 2 new types and the special stat split. There was also the issue of the Gen 2 level curve being horrible. Here's the thing, I don't think that this stuff really mattered back then. Actually put yourself in the shoes of someone experiencing Johto for the first time after you played Red and Blue. These issues wouldn't be something on your mind. You'd only notice the improvements and the fact that you're playing a new Pokemon adventure. Is this nostalgia farming to give this generation some more points? Yeah, probably. But hey, these games were still working out the kinks, so I'll give them a break. After Gen 2, there was a console jump to the Game Boy Advance. This change in platform gave Pokemon the chance to make some big changes too, and that they did. The game was visually a lot better, the music was much more complex and pleasant to listen to, and the gameplay was changed a lot. For those interested in competitive Pokemon, this is the point in the franchise where they actually started optimizing for it. The addition of EVs, IVs, abilities, and natures all encouraged competitive battling, at least offline. Was this system perfect? Not at all. This was a step in the right direction for the competitive scene though, but it had a long way from being taken seriously like it is today. As a generation though, Gen 3 could be argued to have the most impact ever, and it was the point where I feel like Nintendo started to really understand the direction the games needed to go to stay afloat. I also have to mention that this generation had the first Gen 1 remakes, which were quite good, although not that different from the Hoenn games. Outside of the mainline games, we saw a ton of great spin-offs in this early era too. Pokemon Stadium, Colosseum, and Gale of Darkness, Mystery Dungeon, tons of games. I know a lot of people will write off this early era of Pokemon as being antiquated and outdated at this point, but I think if you actually go back and play the games like Emerald especially, you'll be shocked to see how much you can still enjoy it. Wrapping up my ratings of the early era, I put together a nice graphic for you to understand how I felt about it. Clearly I feel quite strongly towards Gen 3, and to me it's the shining star of this group, scoring above average in every category. Although while I feel like Gen 2 is significantly improving from Gen 1, I don't think the impact was as profound as the first and third entries. After combining all of these numbers, the average rating of the early era is 5.95 out of 10. Moving into the middle era, we actually have a pretty rocky start. One thing I haven't really mentioned so far in this video is how important the third versions of Pokemon games tend to be. If you take out Crystal and Emerald from the early era, the already pretty low rating drops to a number I don't even want to share. The problem with Pokemon as a whole is that they always release games that are unpolished. The worst part of this is they re-release the games when they're fully completed, then they charge full price again. It's annoying, but it's something they've always done in some form up to Gen 8, and even now they're just adding DLC instead of re-releasing. That being said, Diamond and Pearl are both very revolutionary, but also flawed games. The jump to DS allowed a lot of positive changes like amazing new sprites and music that we've never heard before, but we also got the ability to play online using the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, the day and night cycle returned and was improved, and Pokemon moves were split into physical or special, but not depending on their type, something that has stuck with the series forever. So with all these great changes, what went wrong with Diamond and Pearl? Well, most notably, the gameplay is very slow, like painfully slow. Besides this, there were very limited options for team building, the story kind of sucked, the trainers had weird teams, the game's overworld was a bit boring at times, and well, it had a lot of issues, that's for sure. Fortunately, Platinum saved the day and fixed most of the original's problems. Aside from fixing the quality of life stuff, Platinum also overhauled the story and added a new area called the Distortion World. It also brought back the Battle Frontier, which was randomly excluded from Diamond and Pearl. Platinum still isn't the best paced game ever, and the options for team building still kind of neglect fire types as a whole, but it's still a great step in the right direction, and I think it's one of the most impactful generations, spawning the birth of officially run Pokemon World Championships. In Gen 4, we also got Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes of Pokemon Gold and Silver. These are some of the most nostalgic Pokemon games out there, and I think that this is largely due to the passion and love put into the visuals and soundtrack of the game. While it did not fix a lot of the gameplay and pacing issues of Gold and Silver, it still remains a fun game to get through. Not to mention it also includes a massive post-game with the Battle Frontier too. Jumping into Gen 5, we stay on the DS, but this doesn't mean there weren't any visual improvements. This time, we got a lot of new animations and sprite work. The overworld was also made to be a lot more cinematic and detailed. While there might not have been a lot of changes in terms of balancing, battling was still novel due to Black and White giving us a ton of brand new Pokemon and saving the older ones for the post-game exclusively. The biggest jump Black and White and Black and White 2 had was the story though. Narratively, Platinum was quite deep in the sense that the stakes were high and the characters had decent writing. In Gen 5, we get a story that really does its best to have a lot of possibilities for interpretation. While Cyrus was clearly in the wrong with his goals, Team Plasma has a lot of room to be morally ambiguous. Characters like N proved that Pokemon could be a story-driven game if the developers want it to be. A criticism about Gen 5 is its linearity, but I would argue that in order for the story and overall experience to be better, the game had to be linear. As for the music, it was just as good as Gen 4's, although its focus was shifted slightly in terms of how they utilize different sounds. It doesn't make it better or worse than Gen 4, just different. In Black and White 2, we ended up getting largely new games instead of a typical re-release thing they do. While the region is technically the same as Black and White, it adds a bunch of new areas and makes changes to existing ones. Also, older Pokemon were available from the beginning of the journey, allowing for the best team building in a Pokemon game that I have seen up to this point. Overall, I think this is the best 2D Pokemon had looked and played. It's unfortunate that people couldn't see this on release, as Gen 5 is not exactly the best selling generation of all time. In fact, I can remember at the time how much hate these games got. Moving into the start of the 3D era though, you would think that I'd place these into the modern age, but honestly, they don't change as much as you would think. As for what they did add though, there are three major things: fairy types, in-battle transformations, and the EXP share change. For the first time since Gen 2, Pokemon decided to add a new type, being Fairy. This turned the competitive scene upside down, especially considering the addition of Mega Evolution. This was an in-battle transformation that immensely boosted the stats of Pokemon and could even change its typing. While it would only be around for one generation, the ripples of Mega Evolution would not be forgotten, inspiring future concepts seen in every Pokemon game since. Besides all that, X and Y's jump into 3D was definitely cool, but it's not like it was a crazy visual change we couldn't imagine. The models of the Pokemon were fine and the moves looked decent enough. From what I've heard in the community though, and my own opinion, I much prefer the 2D artwork to this 3D look. Another divisive part of this game had to do with the difficulty being seemingly easier than previous releases. I've actually replayed all of these Pokemon games in the past year, and I don't agree that X and Y are easy. Just because you can grind faster with the new EXP share doesn't mean the battles are easier. In fact, I think certain fights in the game were relatively harder than some someone like Cynthia. The other batch of games in Gen 6 was Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. These games were remakes of Gen 3 and they improved them in almost every way. After replaying Emerald, I definitely noticed that this game's difficulty dropped significantly in the remakes. The visuals might be in 3D too, but sometimes I feel like they could have been more detailed with the world, although being on the 3DS might have limited them a bit. It's also unfortunate that these games had no battle frontier, something that people loved in Emerald. Despite the bad, I think ORAS was a very interesting interpretation of Hoenn with new additions like flying in the sky on a Latios or Latias, or bringing back old legendary Pokemon in a really interesting and cool way. While the narrative in X and Y was a bit less of a focus than in Gen 5, ORAS did have a bit better of a story. They even made a brand new storyline up toward the end of the game surrounding Zinnia and Rayquaza. Out of all the changes though, I have to say that this soundtrack is something that I don't think ever could be topped. While the modern era might bring a modern sound in terms of music, I think ORAS brought the old catchy soundtrack of Emerald to life with orchestral instruments, and I love it. Overall, the middle era of Pokemon is something that I know a lot of my viewers will find nostalgic. Beyond the nostalgia though, I think you could tell how much love the developers had for making games, especially around the Gen 4 and 5 times. So after calculating the numbers, the average score for the middle era is 8.19 out of 10. I should also mention now, when I determine the score for the visuals, it's not meant to be compared to other games, but rather how pleasing the game actually looks. Because obviously newer games will have better graphics than older games, but I'm really looking at how pleasant things like sprites or character models look in general. Even 2D sprites can be beautiful. Alright, now let's look at the modern era. Pokemon Sun and Moon flipped the script on Pokemon's gameplay loop of collecting 8 gym badges and decided to replace them with something called Island Challenges. Effectively, these had the same purpose as gyms, although they focused less on battling and more on various challenges that depended on the situation. This change really divided the fanbase at the time, but it's clear that they did not land, as they have never returned since. I think a big part of the dislike was that the different is bad mentality is quite strong, but they also failed to provide that same feeling of progression like gyms did. With the gyms, it really felt like you were working toward being the best battler in the region, while Sun and Moon's trials really just felt like a gimmick. The game also made some other gameplay changes, like completely replacing Mega Evolution with Z-moves. This is one of the worst changes I've ever seen Pokemon do because Z-moves are so incredibly boring and Mega Evolution is awesome. On the more positive side, they removed HMs completely, which felt long overdue at this point. The game also introduced a new concept called regional forms of Pokemon. Basically, certain Pokemon would have different forms depending on the region they originated from. I actually really like this idea a lot, and it's stuck with the franchise ever since. Aside from a few innovative changes, I don't have much great to say about this game. For some reason, they decided to bring back the concept of re-releasing the same game with extra content for full price. Ultra Sun and Moon are actually a lot better than the originals, but I think it's extremely lame to do this business model, and it turned me away from the series for years. It's not like this is a particularly new concept, but the fact that I thought they did away with this since Gen 5 really disappointed me. In Ultra Sun and Moon, they added a new type of Pokemon called an Ultra Beast. These were only ever in these games, and while they are transferable to new generations, they haven't gotten any new additions. Overall, I didn't enjoy Sun and Moon as much as any other game in the previous era, and it's unfortunate to see that these things really wouldn't get much better with the new entry in the franchise, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Pokemon's introduction to the Switch was not one with much to talk about. Sure, it was enjoyable to an extent and the music was actually phenomenal, but besides that, this game wasn't anything new. Another remake of Kanto with worse writing and easier battles isn't exactly what I wanted. I think it is fun, and actually more fun than Sun and Moon, but besides that, it's not an impressive title, and it's clear they weren't trying to allocate all of their resources into it. Gen 7's overall lack of impact really disappointed me, and I feel like it's truly the forgotten generation. It's not like there isn't anything great about these games, but I think when you see how great Pokemon was prior to these, it just doesn't make sense what happened here. I think these games are also what really pushed forward the frustration people started to have with the Pokemon Company trying to farm money out of their fans, using tactics like re-releasing Sun and Moon and nostalgia farming remakes to line their pockets. Honestly, I just hated it. Gen 8 would actually bring the first major Pokemon title to the Switch, and a lot changed. While we ended up getting the 8 gym badges back, we lost something that we took for granted in the previous games: the ability to catch them all. Hundreds of people's favorite Pokemon went missing in this game, literally unobtainable even if you wanted to transfer them from old games. Another major change people had a lot to say about was the new semi-open world areas in the game. These wild areas did not lock you to a beaten path, however, they were not as cool as it seemed. The graphics in these were downright ugly at times, and they felt super empty. Visually, Sword and Shield was not a bad looking game, in fact it was a huge step up from Let's Go. The issue was that it was not optimized very well, an issue that has plagued the Pokemon company since. Ignoring the negatives though, one cool change Sword and Shield brought back was the concept of in-battle transformations with Gigantamaxing. While it wasn't quite like Mega Evolution, I do enjoy these forms a lot, giving value to different kinds of Pokemon from new and old games alike. The last major thing I should mention about Sword and Shield is the addition of paid DLC, which is arguable whether or not it's better than re-releasing the game. I think it's fine and a lot less predatory than what Ultra Sun and Moon did, but I think the overall issue with Gen 8 was that Pokemon felt like it was betraying the fans in a lot of different ways. This was the start of a terrible streak of years where Pokemon knew they could release anything and sell record-breaking numbers every time. Speaking of which, the games after this, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, were some of the worst games ever released from Pokemon, and they sold amazingly. These Gen 4 remakes weren't even made by Game Freak this time, and it seems like their only purpose was to bring Sinnoh to kids who haven't experienced it before Legends Arceus. They didn't even want to include improvements from Platinum either, they literally just remade the mediocre originals of the 4th generation. I have nothing to say about this game. The art direction of this game is horrible and incredibly unserious for one of the most serious Pokemon games. The gameplay is the same as ever, and it just feels like you're playing a game with incredible missed potential, but hey, at least the music is amazing. The final game of Gen 8 is one that I actually have nothing bad to say about at all. Pokemon Legends Arceus was a massive step forward in innovation for the franchise, bringing us a brand new concept that has crazy potential. In this open world experience, we're taken to the past of Sinnoh. Using the nostalgia of Sinnoh, they could try a bunch of new things without feeling scared of making things too new. I'm not gonna lie, the world doesn't feel super full of things to do, but if you're looking for a game to relax and enjoy Pokemon on the Switch, I think it's perfect. Considering that the next big Pokemon game will be a Legends game, I'd like to think that this idea landed well with everyone. I'm excited to see where things go from here. And now we're at the most recent game of the modern era, Scarlet and Violet. This entry had a lot of expectations behind it on release. It would cement itself as the first mainline Pokemon game that's completely open world. We already saw the potential of Legends Arceus' open world, so we were expecting even better. These games took things in a new direction while keeping concepts relatively the same. While you could still take on the 8 gyms, Scarlet and Violet made it a point to encourage any type of playstyle. If you like competitive battling, you have options beyond any other game previously. If you wanted to focus more on quests, they have a bunch of objectives for you to complete surrounding the story. The sense of this region of Paldea was that Pokemon as a hobby or profession is standardized. Like there's literally a school system designed for Pokemon trainers that you participate in for the story. But I believe that this game's downfall is also what could have made it so good. This ambition for the perfect Pokemon game led them to releasing Gen 9 in a broken state. The game ran like absolute garbage on release and would only barely improve later. This was the worst 3D Pokemon has ever looked in terms of the overworld too. There's just a whole lot of nothing here, and when there is stuff, the game lags. It's a shame because the character models actually look pretty solid and impressive, but the world is so ugly. I also have to commend the fantastic music in this game. A lot changed with the music team around this time, but it's safe to say that Pokemon's music is in good hands going forward. In theory, Scarlet and Violet could have easily been the greatest Pokemon games ever released. Instead, they're a showcase of the Switch's crappy hardware, Game Freak's laziness, and overall, they are the pinnacle of disappointment in Pokemon. The modern era of Pokemon is one of immense innovation and disappointment. While certain things ended up changing for the better, other parts felt like slaps in the face of fans who had dumped hundreds of dollars into the franchise. Calculating the scores of the modern era, we get an average rating of 7.38 out of 10, meaning the golden age of Pokemon is somewhat predictably the middle era. I think that the time period of the DS and early 3DS was one filled with passion on the side of Game Freak. You can tell that the developers loved ensuring a memorable and nostalgic experience for players of games like Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Black and White. They were able to balance creativity with a sleek and consistent game design. It's only when they started to change too much at once is where I think problems began to arise. When they tried to elevate their games to new heights with amazing writing and gameplay, unfortunately sales decreased, and when they took a step back with passion fashion and optimized for money and putting games out yearly, sales only increased. So can I exactly blame Pokemon for putting out some stinkers recently? Not really, but I definitely hate them for it. Fortunately, Scarlet and Violet is the last game they've made, and it's been a few years now. It seems as if the Pokemon company is willing to slow down the machine and make something truly revolutionary once again with the release of Pokemon Legends ZA. I'm excited to see how that game turns out. But I want to hear what your favorite era of Pokemon was in the comments, since I'm just a random dude on the internet. Also, I have a Patreon in the top link of the description if you want to participate in polls, get behind the scene videos, and support the channel. We are so close to 5k subs, so let's see if we can get there and get to 10k by the end of 2025. Thanks for watching, guys.